is sponsored by Rosina Fisher for Yortzeit, Adat Neshama, Yortzeit of her husband, Mordechai Avigdor ben Peretz, Zechrono Livracha, and for our parents, Chia Esther Bat Yerachmiel Yisachar HaKohen, Aleh Shalom, and Yitzchak Yehuda, Zechrono Livracha. May their memories be a blessing. Yes. Shir is, every shir this year is in memory of Elisheva Frist, Elisheva Sima Bat Zalman, Zechrono Livracha. Okay, put this here. Okay. We did not meet last week. It was Yom Zikaron and then Yom Ha'atzmaut. But we're in a particular season that's somewhat complex. We have the mitzvah of Sfirat Omer, which binds with Pesach and Shavuot, as we know. But it's also a period of partial mourning, miktzat avelut, partial mourning. And to this end, we're going to see that a particular poem that we actually recite on Tisha B'Av, commemorating the pogroms of the 11th century, 1096 specifically, the First Crusade, where several cities, major Torah centers in Germany, were obliterated. And we're talking about the three cities of Speyer, Mainz, and Worms. They are known as the Arei Shum. Shin, Speyer, Vav is Vermeise, and Shin is Speyer. So you have the Mem is Begensia, which is Mainz. The Arei Shum. There happened to be a concept, you can even see it on the encyclopedia, you can Google it as well, Takanot Shum. What happened was that after the decimation of these cities, and then remnants came back to Germany eventually, they made all kinds of institutions that had to do with how to conduct business and not to antagonize the local Gentiles, and they were called Takanot Shum. So the word Shum, Shin Vav Mem, is known, and sometimes you even shudder, because on the one hand, they were an unbelievable collection of Talmidei Chachamim and Torah centers that in practically one swipe, it was lost. In a small scale, for them it was a Holocaust. We like not to use the word Holocaust except for the Holocaust, and we have trouble with October 7th also, and I remind people it might be legitimate to speak of a frame of the Holocaust that we may have unfortunately experienced on October 7th, but never to call the event a Holocaust. It's not right, it's not fair, it's doing an injustice to the Shoah. I mean, even in pure numbers. So to us, to know that close to 2,000 people lost their lives, whether civilians and Chayalim, is very painful, extremely painful and all that. But on any given day, for 6 years, 5,000 people, Jews, lost their lives every single day in the days of the Shoah. And the market difference was that the day after October 7th, there was a tzahal and went into action. We're not going to go into, the successes or political or whatever, but that we didn't have in the Shoah for Am Yisrael to react. Nor did Am Yisrael in 1096 have the ability to react to the wave of pogroms of the Crusaders who were en route to capture Yerushalayim from the Muslims. I mean, Yerushalayim was not in our hands then. It was under Muslim rule. And the Crusades came to take over Eretz Yisrael and specifically Yerushalayim in those days, but on the way to already deal the death blow to Jewish communities. And it wasn't just these three cities. These three cities were the major Torah centers, but many other communities were decimated as well. At various kinot were written, elegies were written about this period, and some of them were integrated into the book of Kinot for Tisha B'Av to be recited annually. The most famous of them is this particular kinah, beginning with Yiten Roshi Mayim, as if to say, I need a head that is swollen with water because I have so many tears. I'm crying so much, I need an unending supply of tears. Yiten Roshi Mayim, which comes out of Eicha, Yiten Roshi Mayim, which many of the Paitanim would lift out of context from Eicha, a phrase here and there, just to get on track and to see what they're going to do. But in this particular poem, if you just look at the first two lines, what happened was the poem was, I printed this out on 2 pages, nice and neatly, and somehow in the computer of the center, it used a different font, and that's why it came out in three sides, basically 2.5 sides. Where's my pen? Here it is. So I'm just going to read the first stanza, and basically it's saying crying, 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 crying. And the crying theme is at the beginning, it's at the end, and it's in the middle, and as if the poet, who comes from the Kalonymus family, a very, very famous Ashkenazi family who Rashi even quotes, and Rashi is pre the First Crusade. He's in the middle of the 11th century. Rashi quotes this illustrious family who hailed from Italy, but then migrate to Germany, and they are big Talmidei Chachamim. They are poets as well, and many of the poems that we have for Kinot, but also for Slichot and also for Zmirot, come from the Kalonymus family. So this is one of the famous Kalonymus poems, Yiten Roshi Mayim, where it's almost like sometimes at a very, very tragic hesped, somebody is giving a eulogy and can't control himself during the eulogy itself. And as getting out a few words, but then breaking down, crying, and then getting out a few more words and breaking down, crying. I'm sure, unfortunately, you know what I'm talking about. And that's how this poem is being written. It's being written that there's crying at the beginning, at the end, and in the middle, all along. So the first 2 lines, just crying. Yiten Roshi Mayim ve'einai mikor nozlai. I need, a source of tears that's running and running from my eyes. Ve'efke kol yemotai ve'lalai. I'm going to cry day and night. It was just unceasing crying and wailing. Al chalalai tapai va'olalai. Over the halal is the dead bodies of my children, young, very young, very young, and yisheshai kaholai, and the elders of our community, which means these pogroms of 1096 did not escape the young and the old. Everyone was here, and they were pshutei am. They were simple people. He didn't hit the point yet that he's going to talk about the great Talmidei Chachamim who perished and the great Torah centers. But never forget that when that happens, there are also regular people who also perished. So 2 weeks ago, we did the piyut for the Shoah from the Baba Rebbe. I made that point that sometimes there's a heavy focus on the loss of the Jewish centers, the communities, the yeshivot, the Beit Knesset, and so on. And for sure, that's major in the Shoah, but the Shoah is a lot more than that. And here, Kalonymus is trying to point out that it was a lot more than just the destruction of the Torah centers. It was tapai v'olalai, yishishei, kehalai. It was the young, the babies, the elders. It was everybody. V'atem anu avoy voy. We use this phrase in modern Hebrew. Oy vavoy, oy vavoy. Right? Nebuch. That's what it is. Oy vavoy v'alai uvechein b'chol becher rav v'herev. Again, expressions of constant cry. It's possible he has the pasuk b'chol tivkeh from Eicha in his mind. Al Beit Yisrael v'al al Am Hashem ki naflu b'charef. He's going to cry on the house of Am Yisrael and the nation of God. It's the same thing, but it's 2 different things. It's the same thing and 2 different things. I'm not giving a commercial now, but this evening at the Har Chorev Shul in Katamon, so I'm on rotation to speak at the 8:30 shir tonight. I'm speaking about the dual Kedusha of Kedoshim to you. And you have it right here. There's a connection to Klal Yisrael, and there's a connection one-on-one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's who we are. To say that we're a part of Beit Yisrael, and it's Am Hashem, a nation that has a unique relationship one-on-one with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ki naflu b'charev. We fell by sword. And he's going to go on to explain, and I'm going to jump now for a moment, to stanza number Zayin. Just scroll down, Al Beit Gimel Dalet Hey Vav Zayin, on this page, and it says, Simuna al levavchem misped mar lekoshra. The phrase misped mar is used, it's also Tanachic, it's used, a bitter eulogy. Pay attention. Ki shkula harigatam letabel uleteafra kisreifat beit Elokeinu ha'ulam b'habira. What I'm describing here is equivalent to the mourning of the Beit HaMikdash. The ulam, which is the central heichal of Beit HaMikdash, and the bira, which is, we use it today calling it a capital city, but most probably all of Yerushalayim. V'chi ein lahosif moed shever v'tavera. There's no need to add another season. And it's reference to Tisha B'Av. Kara alai moed. It's season. It's not a Yom Tov. There's no need to put something new in the calendar. Ve'ein lahakdim zulati la'achara. There's no need to make an earlier date. I mean, here we are in the month of Iyar, but we have Av coming around the corner. There's no need to introduce here another fast day, another Memorial Day. Ein lahakdim zulati le'achara. This is a little problematic because the word zulati means except. You can actually postpone. What is it? What is this? And in Boston, when our great Rabbi Rabbi was teaching Kinot, he actually was troubled by this particular phrase and gave a variety of suggestions. One of them, which, Lefi Aniyut Dati, in my humble opinion, I think he was right, and that is, the poet is simply quoting an interesting halakha about fast days, and that is that if a fast day comes out on Shabbat, we never make the fast day earlier, we would make it later, right? We'd rather fast on Sunday than to fast on Friday or Thursday because we can't fast on Shabbat, whether it's Tisha B'Av, Shavasa B'Tammuz, or Sar B'Tevet. So we know that that's the case. We always push it forward, and it's based on a Gemara that Akdume Puanut Lo Makdimim. We never make the reflections of a harsh day earlier. It's bad enough that we have to observe it, but we don't have to bring it earlier. But later, we can push it. We're always willing to push off Puranut. That we can do. And I think what the poet is doing here is he's just invoking that halakha. Ein lahakdim zulati la'achara. We're not allowed to make it mugdam. You're not allowed to make it earlier, but you can, just parenthetically, it can be pushed later. And what he's saying is that there's no need to make a special day to remember these events that he talked about, and we're going to reread this poem of the cities of Shum, because it's already in the calendar. Which day is in the calendar? Tachat Hakein Hayom Livyati Erora. It's in the calendar today. Today is Tisha B'Av, because this poem was written to be a Tisha B'Av elegy, Kina. And the author is saying there's no need to have another day. Why not? So take a look at source number 1 on the page. It might be on your second page. I don't have the double page. Source number 1 of the sources. And this from the Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit, the very end of the Gemara, Daf Chavtet. And it quotes the pasuk from the Meraglim story. So the Mishnah there in Masechet Ta'anit teaches us that 5 events occurred on Tisha B'Av. 5 occurred on Shavasa B'Tammuz and 5 occurred on Tisha B'Av. And one of the events that occurred on Tisha B'Av was that was the day the Meraglim, the 40 scouts, came back from Canaan, from Eretz Canaan, and delivered their report. What? The 12, I'm sorry. The 12 scouts came back from Eretz Canaan and delivered their report, which was factually true, except the tone the intonation was, we don't have a chance to make it, and everything collapsed right then and there. So the Torah says that everybody cried that night. Vatisa kol ha'edah vayitnu et kolam vayivku ha'am balaylahu. And that night they were just crying. So the Gemara says on this pasuk in source number 1, Amar Rabba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ota Laila Leil Tisha B'Av Haya. It was the night of Tisha B'Av. Amar Lahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Atem bechitem b'chiyah shel chinam. You guys are crying for no reason. I'm going to give you something, a good reason to cry about. V'ani kovei lechem b'chiyah ledorot. And I'm going to establish for you that on this night, years later, generations later, there's going to be what to cry about. And what the Chachamim said was that Tisha B'Av in the Torah itself, by allusion to what happened to the generation that cried on the night that the Meraglim returned back to the camp, was that Tisha B'Av was going to be the day that OUisrael is going to recognize its tzarot. So whether it's the first Beit HaMikdash and the second Beit HaMikdash and tzarot that would happen afterwards, I mean, here, the poet, Rabbi Klonimus, is actually saying that that which happened in the month of Iyar is going to be commemorated on the very day that we commemorate other tragedies, and that's Tisha B'Av, and so on. This is what led the Rav to formulate his opinion about the fact that the Shoah should be commemorated as well on Tisha B'Av, and his belief was that there's really no need. I mentioned this 2 weeks ago, I'm just repeating this. There's no need for new poems to be authored in our generation. He felt we could snuff out everything about the Shoah in the existing book. I mentioned that in the keynote of the OU that has the Rav's commentary on Tisha B'Av, they themselves are aware of this and say that nevertheless, the Batei Knesset want to say these various poems, and in the edition of the Tisha B'Av keynote with the Rav's explanations, you have the 5 keynote for the Shoah, the one that we did last week included. He never said that. He never said that, for sure not. He talked about the Shoah often during his discussions of the keynote. That's no question about it. So much so that when Menachem Begin, Zichron Livracha, came to the States for the first time as prime minister in the summer of 1977, and visited Rav Moshe Feinstein and the Rav Lubavitcher Rebbe and the Rav. So he had an agenda for all 3 of them. There was one particular question that he wanted to hear their view, and that was a suggestion to move Yom HaShoah to Tisha B'Av. And all 3 of these Gedolim said it's a good idea. All 3 of them. And what happened was, Begin came back to Israel, and his education minister at the time was, as they say, Mishalanu, was Zvulun Hammer, Zichron Livracha, from the Mizrahi, from the Mafdal. He said there's only one problem. Tisha B'Av is in the summer vacation. And if we're going to have Yom HaShoah in the middle of the summer, we're not going to be able to educate for the Shoah properly. And it's much better that it's in the school season. And that's why Zvulun Hammer overruled Begin on this one. And Yom HaShoah, the rest is history. We still do it in the month of Nisan. But nevertheless, you have here in the poem itself. So today, we're in the middle of the Omer. Today is the 9th day of Iyar and the 24th day of the Omer, almost halfway done. It's interesting that we have this feeling of Avelut, and the question is, where does it come from? Just 2 days ago, one of my daughters sent me a WhatsApp about buying something new, making Shechianu in the days of the Omer. Can you do it or not? Okay, it's a legitimate question, and sometimes there's confusion with the minhagim that go on in the 3 weeks and the 9 days. And the question is, which is more of a serious type of avelut? On the surface, I would say that the avelut of the 9 days and then expanded by Ashkenazim to the 3 weeks is much more serious than the avelut of the Sfira, because the Avelut of the Tisha B'Av, and the week of Tisha B'Av, Shvuah Chalbo, and the 9 days, that's mentioned already in the Mishnah. That Mishnah Nichnas Av Mima'atim B'Simcha, that's a Mishnah. And the Shvuah Chalbo, that's a Mishnah. And Erev Tisha B'Av is a Mishnah. It's all, it takes us back. Okay, then the Ashkenazim expanded it to Shavasa B'Tammuz, Beseda. But the Sfira, The Avelut of the Sfira not mentioned neither in the Mishnah, nor in the Gemara Bavli, nor in the Yerushalmi. The first time we actually hear about mourning on any level is in the days of the Geonim. I'm looking at the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries in Baghdad. This is the first time we ever heard of it. And what was done or not done? No weddings. No weddings from Pesach until Shavuot. That's where it starts.
What were they mourning?
What was that?
What were they mourning?
Oh, and they were mourning what the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot teaches us. So if you go to source number 4 on the page, source number 4 is the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot, Samach Bet, that gives us the famous story of the deaths of Rabbi Akiva's 24,000 students. Amru, it was said, Shnei Masar Elev Zugim. Today we would say Zugot, right? The 12,000 pairs. I guess they studied B'Chavruta. So there were 12,000 Chavrutos. So that, if I did the math right, that's 24,000. Hayu le Rabbi Akiva. Mi Gevet ad Antipuras. From north to south of the country. There was they came from all over the place. V'chulan metu beperek echad. And they all died in one season. Mipnei shelo nagu kavod zelazeh. They did not have basic respect one for another. V'haya olam shamem. And the world was desolate, was shocked. Ad shebo Rabbi Akiva, etzel rabotenu shebedarom. And the darom doesn't mean a lot. It means the area of Yavne. And he taught, Shan'ah, doesn't mean sinah, Shan'ah, he taught them to Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Loza, Ben Shamua. You have the continuation, barely so, of the original smicha of old, because all the other Talmidim were wiped out. So he needed some Talmidei Chachamim who were going to carry on with the smicha of old, and he does it with 5, a select group of 5. Vehem hemidu Torah otasha'ah. And on that moment, that means that hour, that means in that time, Torah survives. Torah survives till today. We're sitting and studying Torah, but we don't have the smicha of old. Eventually, that comes to an end. But in the days of Rabbi Akiva, it almost came to an end, and he's able to, before he himself is executed, he's able to pass on the torch to 5 leading Talmidei Chachamim in Yavne. And then the Gemara says, Tana, there's a braita, Kula metu mi Pesach v'Atzeret. They all died from Pesach until Shavuot. Omer Rab Chia bar Abba, Vitema Rab Chia bar Avin. You have 2 different sources who said the following. Kula metu, they all died, mita ra'ah, terrible death. Maihi, what was it? Omer Rav Nachman, askara, some type of epidemic. Like corona. Died from a corona. Something happened, some type of a spread, and they all died in a very, very short amount of time. And the Geonim said that because the Talmidim Rabbi Akiva die in this season, we won't make weddings from Pesach until Shavuot. That's how this all starts. The Rambam never heard of this custom of no mourning in the days of the Omer. Never heard of it. The mourning. What was that? Never. The Rambam never heard of the custom of mourning, of Avelut in the days of the Omer. I always say, I was wondering if the Rambam was even religious. He has no bar mitzvah in his book. He has no Lag Boimer in his book. And he doesn't even have Yom Ha'atzmaut in his book. Yep. But not only the Rambam, if you go back to source number 2 and see it in the Mar Nevuchim, what he thought of the days of the Omer, he's talking about Shavuot, Yom Matan Torah, source number 2, Ulagdil Hayom Hahu Nimnu, to glorify that great day of Kabbalat Torah, we count. He's giving us the rationale for the mitzvah of Sfirat HaOmer, counting the Omer. Nimnu Hayamim Min HaMoed HaRishon Elav. We count from the first marking, which is like going out of Mitzrayim. Kimi shemamtin bo hane'eman shebe'ohavav. It's like somebody who's counting towards something very, very loving and precious. Vehu, like some people count down to their flights and other things. What's important to you? Veshehu moneh yom v'gam ha'sha'ot. We're counting down days, counting down hours. People count towards great moments. V'zot hi sibat sfirat ha'omer miyom tzeitenu mimitzrayim ad yom matan Torah. This is the reason that we count, to build the bridge between the going out of Mitzrayim and Matan Torah, Shehu Hayom Shahaya HaKavana. In modern Hebrew, we write two vavs here. It's the reason, the direction, the focus, V'atachlit, and the purpose of the Yetziatam. Why did we go out of Mitzrayim? It wasn't just to get us out of jail or out of being slaves, but it was to bring us to Matan Torah. Be'omro v'avi etchem elai, to bring Am Yisrael to Him, to God. V'lo haya hamareh hagadol hazeh ela yom echad. That Matan Torah for Am Yisrael was one day, and therefore we celebrate it annually as one day. So here the Rambam in the third chelik, the third book of the Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, where he deals with mitzvah rationale, drops the idea of why we have the mitzvah of Sfirat Omer. Right, so the one who answers the question of we count down, because we learned that from the space program, right, 10, 9, 8, or from a basketball game, but the author of the Sefer Chinuch gives us a reason why our count is towards. He has an answer. He addresses that question, and it's a mitzvah Shin Vav, which is in Parshat Emor, on the pasuk Usfartem Lachem Mimochat HaShabbat, and so on. And there, the Sefer Chinuch adopts the rationale of the Rambam. I must confess, for many years, I thought it was the author of the Sefer Chinuch's invention, who's a student of the Ramban in Barcelona. So I thought he was the author of it. Several years ago, Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, Rav Aaron's son, who's today one of the Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Hatzon, leaked to me that the Rambam beat him to the punch, that the Rambam actually said it before the author of Sefer Chinuch. So I now quote the Rambam as being the author of this and not the author of the Sefer Chinuch. Fine, but it's clear that it's a great season. But if you look at source number 3, the Ramban, shortly after the Rambam, it's even a greater season. Umanu mimenu tishim v'arba yom, we count 49 days, Shiva Shavuot, Kimei Olam, what it means, Kimei Olam, annually, V'kidesh Yom HaShmini Kishmini Shel Chag, just like the 8th day of Shmini Atzeret is after 7 days, we make Shmini Atzeret. Here we count 7 weeks, and the 8th would be Shavuot, symbolically. And that's why Chazal called the day of Shavuot Atzeret, for that reason. Vayamim haspurim beinotayim, beinehem, really, kecholo shel moed, ben harishon v'ashmini kechag. V'hu yom matan Torah. Ramban says, from Pesach until Shavuot is like Chol HaMoed. It's all part of one Yom Tov. So on the first day of Sukkot is Yom Tov, and then you have Chol HaMoed because it's not real Yom Tov, it's quasi Yom Tov. That's what we call it, Chol HaBoed. It's Chol and Moed at the same time. It's a mishmash. And Shmini Atzeret is Yom Tov. So between Pesach and Shavuot, the intermediary days are Chol HaMoed. I remember teaching this to kids in yeshiva, in the high school, and they want to know if they get off. I mean, we have vacation on Chol HaMoed, no? I mean, well, if you're in 12th grade, you're already off since Purim, That's when the year ends Purim time for them. But you see that there is no zecher and no zecher of avelut, of mourning in the days of the Omer by the Rambam and the Ramban. They don't know of it at all. Did they know about the Gemara and Masechet Yevamot? Of course they knew about the Gemara and Masechet Yevamot, that Rabbi Akiva's students perish. But nobody told them that it was a period of mourning. There are a lot of things mentioned in Gemara. That doesn't mean they observed it with a period of mourning. Moreover, in source number 5, and this comes from the Igeret of Rav Shrira Gaon. Who was Rav Shrira Gaon? Rav Shrira Gaon was the father of Rav Hai Gaon. Okay, does that help? We're talking about the period of the Gaonim. So let's just say the title Gaon from the 6th to the 12th century was the Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshivot in Bavel. They eventually all conglomerated around Baghdad. There was Surah, Pumbedita, Neharda'ah. These are household names of people who know where the yeshivot were in Bavel, where the Gemara, Talmud Bavli was written. They didn't close up when the Talmud Bavli was redacted, but they kept studying, they kept adding, kept teaching, and so on. But eventually, these centers all moved to Baghdad. It became the center. By the 9th, 10th century, there was no Surah and Pumbedita, but the tradition was there. Very similar to what happened in 1940, when you have the Lithuanian yeshivas all conglomerating in Vilna, because Vilna was the safe zone, and the Nazis weren't there yet, and they thought it was a safe zone. So all of a sudden in Vilna, you now have the Mir yeshiva. Well, Mir is in Belarus, and you now have this yeshiva and that yeshiva, just like you had after the Shoah, the reincarnation of these yeshivot, the Mir yeshiva, the Brisk yeshiva, the Ponevezh yeshiva, and all these names were yeshivot in Lita and in Lithuania and Poland. But these yeshivot were resurrected and so on. So all the traditions of Surah and Pumbedita, which by the way were different traditions, all conglomerated around Baghdad. So by the days of Rav Hai Gaon, who's probably one of the most famous of the Gaonim, and his father, Rav Shir Gaon. So we're talking about Rav Shir Gaon. It's like between 9th and 10th century. The Gaon was a title from the Pasuk in Yeshayahu, Gaon Yaakov, the bright of the Galut. Yaakov was Am Yisrael in the exile. That's what Ramban teaches us. Matovo Alecha Yaakov, Mishkanotecha Yisrael. So in Galut, the best we can hope for is an Ohel. Ohel is temporary. Ohel is temporary. The Batei Knesset and Chutz La'aretz are only temporary. But that's Yaakov. Here, the word Mishkan actually means Mikdash. Mishkanotecha Yisrael means in Eretz Yisrael, things are more permanent. And that's true, because we build Batei Knesset in Eretz Yisrael with permanent Kedusha, even if the Beit Knesset is destroyed, like in Masada or in the Gamla and the Golan, or they still have Kedusha. I mean, it's just an archaeological find, perhaps, but for us, it still has Kedusha. As opposed to a shul in Chutz La'aretz, the building might still exist, but if the community doesn't exist any longer, like most of the shuls in Eastern Europe that may have survived, there's no Kedusha in those buildings any longer. So you don't have to worry that the town made it into a concert hall or an auditorium or a museum or whatever. Or some of them were made into churches, correct? They certainly don't have Kedushat Beit Knesset any longer. So that's Matovo Alecha Yaakov. Yaakov is temporary, Ohel. So that's why they called the Rosh Yeshiva of the yeshiva in Baghdad, Geon Yaakov. The bright, Geon means bright, the bright, but he was the leader. Now, he could have been an outstanding Talmud Chacham, and many of them were, and he could have been a darn good administrator and fundraiser, and he was also carried the title of Gaon. I'll give you a very good modern example of this, and I'm saying this with all due respect, okay? So at the Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, which morphs eventually into Yeshiva University, so the first president was Dr. Revel. He was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, tremendous Talmud Chacham. He was lucky that his father-in-law was filthy rich in the oil business in Oklahoma, and there's Rabbi Rekefet's biography, which was his doctorate at YU, on Dr. Revel. You see him standing with his Litvisha kapota and in Litvisha beard and everything. Behind him is the oil rigs from Oklahoma. And those rigs got the yeshiva through the Depression. Imagine the president of the yeshiva, they gave a shear. He gave the top shear. Dr. Revel gave the Yoredea shear. And you should know what happened to him in 1940. He had a stroke in the middle of Shir of Yoredea. He went blind and never told the students. He never told the students that he wasn't seeing anything. And he continued to share for half an hour and then asked for some students if they can walk him home. He didn't feel good, to hold him by the side. He didn't tell them that he was blind. And he dies 3 days later in his home. That was Dr. Revel. So that was the first Rosh Yeshiva, a Gaon. The Rav told me he was talking about wild heads. He spoke about the rugged of a Gaon, and then Rabbi Dr. Revel said they were wild, undisciplined minds, as opposed to the Briskers, who were very, very disciplined minds, and so on. And the second was Dr. Belkin. So most people in my generation knew Dr. Belkin as president of the Yeshiva University. Yeah, but those people knew him as a Rosh Yeshiva. He gave shurim at the yeshiva, and he was a Gaon Adir. Talmud, he got smicha from the Chavetz Chaim at age 17. He knew something. And they were mamash gedolim. And so he decided to take on the reins and so on. And then afterwards, we had Rabbi Lamb, who was a seasoned Rav and also in Jewish philosophy, well-known, big Talmud Chacham, and so on. And then there was Mr. Richard Joel, a very nice person, who did not come from the world of the Beit Midrash, nor from the world of academics. And he was president of the yeshiva. They all carried the same title. Why? Just as they were Gaonim. They weren't such Gaonim in our modern sense. So today, when we say somebody's a Gaon, you want to say, wow, he's like outstanding. The only problem is that today, every Tom, Dick, and Harry is now called Harav Gaon. And I remember Rav Avad Yosef wrote a letter. He said that today there's inflation on the title. It doesn't really mean much anymore. I can tell you, if I sometimes get a mail, Harav Gaon, forget it. It doesn't mean anything. It's totally, he's right. In 1984, when the Rav turned 80, right, 1983, when the Rav turned 80, so in the issue of 1984 of Hapardes is a Torah journal from Agudat Yisrael in Borough Park. So it's not exactly a fan club of Yeshiva University, putting it mildly. The editor was a personal friend of the Rav, of Simcha Elberg, Zechron Levracha. And he wrote a beautiful, beautiful piece honoring the Rav on his 80th birthday, and it's entitled Sar HaTorah, the Minister of Torah. And he writes two things there that we as Talmidim knew, but it was good that the 14th Avenue Borough Park should hear it. He said, anybody who hasn't ever heard a shir from the Rav, never heard a good shir in his life. That was a takeoff on whoever didn't see it, the building that Hordus built. Never saw a beautiful building, the Beit HaMikdash, and the end of Beit Sheni, the binyan of Hordus, of Herod's building. And then he said, the Rav restored credibility to the word Gaon. That's what he wrote. And I was happy he wrote that, because in Borough Park, everybody is a Rav Goin. Everybody. It doesn't mean anything anymore. If everybody's a Rav Goin, so what does it mean? So he said, the Rav restored credibility. What? Means you give money. Good. There you go, Rav Goin. So now we're talking about one of the Gaonim. Why do I say this about the Gaonim? That some of the Gaonim were administrators, but they were still carried the title, Gaon. So some were outstanding Talmidei Chachamim, like Rav Yehuda Gaon, and Rav Hai Gaon, and Rav Saadia Gaon was probably the most famous of all of the Gaonim, who was not only a halachis, but also a Baal Machshava. Yeah.
I still wonder, every time I read about people,
Yeah.
Harav,
Yeah, right.
everybody is a Rav.
Everybody's a Rav.
Is that an honorary title, or do all these people have smicha?
No, they not necessarily have smicha. There are people in the Knesset who called Harav also, and I wouldn't ask them a shaila, okay?
So we
Okay.
just overuse the name.
Yeah. Right. I remember Rabbi Joseph Luxstein, Zechron Levracha, he talked about guys who got smicha at the yeshiva and then went out to business, which is perfectly okay. So he said, all right, if you get called up to the Aliyah, to the Torah, you want to be Harav so-and-so, okay. But if you're selling underwear, don't tell people you're a rabbi. That's what he said. That was his line. Remember? That was his line. I remember, Joe Luxstein. Yeah. So, yeah.
When did the Ashkenazim take on?
I'm getting to it. Yeah. So here you have Rav Shrira Gaon taking issue with or qualifying what happened to the students of Rabbi Akiva. And he says the following. He says, this letter is a very long-winded letter that was written to Rav Shrira Gaon. How was the Mishnah composed? How was the Gemara composed? And what came out was a book. Source number 5. And when he gets to the period of Rabbi Akiva, he cites the Gemara. Masar Rabbi Akiva at Atzmo lahariga. Rabbi Akiva was executed. Achar sheniftar Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma v'ne'erag Rabbi China ben Tranyon. This is what we call the Asara Harugei Malchut, right? The great leaders. V'nitma'ata ha'chochma achreihem. And unfortunately, Torah took a dive. Ve'emid Rabbi Akiva talmideihem harbei. Rabbi Akiva had many students. V'havi shmada ala talmidim shel Rabbi Akiva. What does the word shmad mean? Shmad is a tough word. It usually means, in a modern sense, that they left the fold and they forced conversions. Correct. But that's not what he means here. There were no forced conversions in those days. That's not what he means. It was used in the context of Jews who were murdered al Kiddush Hashem. That was called shmad. That was called Shmad. So you take the battle between Yaakov and Esav, and Yaakov is victorious, except that he's wounded. Vahut solea al yirecho. He's limping. So the Medrash says, Eile dorot hashmad. That's the generation of all those Bnei Yaakov who are going to fall, And the falling doesn't necessarily mean it's also conversion, but it's Jews who are murdered, al Kiddush Hashem. And basically, what the Rabbi Shvira Goin is alluding to is that why did they die and where did they die? What was the context? It was the Bar Kokhba revolution that Rabbi Akiva was very, very involved in. And you can see this in source number 6. The Rambam wants to prove that Mashiach does not have to bring miraculous scenes, miracles, and all kinds of miraculous situations. And he derives it from Bar Kokhba. He says, Val yaleh al hadat, שהמלך המשיח צריך לעשות אותות מופתים ומחדש דברים בעולם או מחיי מתים. Don't think for a moment that Melech HaMashiach has to perform miracles or bring up the dead and so on. וכיוצא בדברים אלו. אין הדבר כן. Nonsense, says the Rambam. שהרי רבי עקיבא חכם גדול מחכמי המשנה היה. This is the first and only time I ever saw the Rambam give out a grade to any of the Chachamim. He was top. He was the top of the Chachamim, the Tanaim of the Mishnah. V'hu haya nosei kelav shel ben Kuzi b'hamelech. He was the right-hand man of Bar Kokhba. What is the word nosei kelim? So I translated it loosely. He was the right-hand man of Bar Kokhba. And v'hu haya omer alav shu melech Mashiach. He declared that he was Mashiach. V'dimahu v'chol chachmei daro. Eventually, Rabbi Akiva convinces all the others to go with Bar Kokhba. Shehu melech HaMashiach. Ad shene'arag b'avanot. When Bar Kokhba was killed, then retroactively we realized that he wasn't Mashiach. I've actually told this to some of my Chabad friends. Okay, Rebbe Mashiach, but he's no longer here. So they have their own answers to that too. But Rambam says the minute Bar Kokhba dies, it's obvious, it's self-evident that he wasn't Mashiach. But I have a hunch that the Rambam, by using the phrase nosei kelav, today when you say nosei kelim, you most probably mean commentators on the Rambam. When you look at a standard Rambam text and you see the Kesef Mishnah of Yosef Karo on the right and the Maggid Mishnah on the left and the Mishnah Lamelech on the bottom, they're called the Noise Kalim of Rambam. You know what the Noise Kalim is? If you know the game of golf, so the golfer doesn't schlep the caddy. He schleps the little wagon, right? What? The plumber's assistant. He's the Noise Kalim. But the phrase Noise Kalim is Tanachic, and it always means the sidekick of the king who schleps his sword. You think the king carries his sword and carries his armor? Somebody's got to schlep it for. So David HaMelech was the Noise Kalim for Shaul. Not only a son-in-law, but he was the Noise Kalim. And there were others in Tanakh who are called the Noise Kalim. If you Google it, if you go and you'll see every single usage of Noise Kalim is military in Tanakh. And I believe that the Rambam is subtly telling us that what Rav Shvira Goin wrote, the Rambam may have had awareness of this, that these Talmidei Chachamim didn't perish because of Corona, but they fell in battle. And Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kokhba, this was a military alliance. He was the Noise Kalim, and he sent his students out to battle. And unfortunately, they died in battle. And the question that Chazal asked in the Gemara was, why did they fall? And the answer was, Lo na'agu kavod zu l'zu, because they did not respect one another. Which means that if you want to know if it's Mashiach or not, you must first answer the question: did we solve the issue? Did we solve the issue of what brought down the second Beit HaMikdash? And in source number 7, the Gemara tells us that while the first Beit HaMikdash was brought down because of idolatry and Gilui Arayot and Shvichut Damim, the big 3 Averot, the second Beit HaMikdash, the Gemara says, Hayu oskim b'Torah mitzvot, milut chasadim. My gosh, they were Torah-abiding citizens, and with chesed, mipnei macharev, why was it destroyed? Mipnei shaita bo sinat chinam. So what is sinat chinam? Sinat chinam doesn't mean you have a grudge against somebody because he did you wrong in business. That's not chinam. Sinat chinam means there's no reason under the sun why you don't love this Jew. There's no reason. Oh, because his grandmother's from Morocco? So you got a problem with him?
Do you have to,
Oh, got a crooked nose?
do you have to love him or not hate him?
It's both. Not hating,
No, not hating is not necessarily love.
right, that's already a famous,
Civil, tolerant.
right, but Ahavat Yisrael, if a person is not engaged in Ahavat Yisrael, then for some reason he doesn't like the guy. For some reason, why can't you help him? I don't know. Don't like him. That's sinat chinam. You just don't know. Might not be a deep hatred and so on, but it's bad enough that brought down Beit HaMikdash. Rabbi Akiva had to answer the question, did we solve that problem? If under his own nose he's got 24,000 Talmidim, Shalom Nahagu Kavod Zu Lazu, who didn't have basic respect for each other, in Hebrew we call it firgun. It comes from Yiddish, so fraginin. That's where the Hebrew word firgun comes from. Means to, listen, you came to shul, you can give a better Dvar Torah than the Rav who just got up there. And you go over him after the drasha and you say, that was a wonderful Dvar Torah. So what? So you give him a compliment. Lefargenoto. So what did these do? They were, look, I was a rabbi in the various stations, and I was blessed with Talmidei Chachamim who, Baruch Hashem, didn't walk out on the shiurim and on the Divrei Torah. But I have friends who had Talmidei Chachamim as balabatim, and sometimes when the rabbi gave a shiur, they'd never show up, or they'd even walk out on a drasha, or open up a sefer when the rabbi's speaking, just to show everybody else that I can do better. That's called lo nagu kavod zu lazu. Doesn't mean that when a Talmud walked in, the other guy didn't stand up for him. They did things that showed total disrespect for one another. And Rabbi Akiva didn't see it. He didn't see it to correct it. And that's why everything collapses. That's why everything collapses. Yeah, one second. Yeah, Baksha, Rivka, yeah.
We had in the shir yesterday, they discussed this, and he said, what was Rabbi Akiva's main sentence that we know?
Yeah. V'aftal re'acha kamocha zeh klal gadol b'Torah. Yeah.
That his students,
Yeah. Lo nagu kavod zu lazu. Right. It can happen. You see, it can happen. It can. Yeah, Baksha.
How would you explain Rabbi Akiva's awful mistake in choosing Bar Kochba and following him, which cost us so much, not only in victims, but also in loss of the land and perhaps 2,000 years of exile?
Okay, so you're already being judgmental that he made a mistake. Maybe he didn't make a mistake. Maybe OUisrael didn't rise to the occasion. And maybe it could have been Yemot HaMashiach. Just as Chazal say, Chizkiah could have been Yemot HaMashiach, and the battles with Ashur could have been Mechemet Gog and Magog. We missed the opportunity. There was an opportunity here. There was a real opportunity. We set up an independent state. Bar Kochba minted coins of Shimon Nisi Yisrael, which means Melech B'Yisrael. So it could have happened. There were plans to build the third Beit HaMikdash. It could have happened, and Chazal were trying to ask the question, why didn't it happen? And why didn't they write the truth in the Gemara Masechet Yevamot? It's called internal censorship. The Romans were still around when this Maimer Chazal was written about the students. And the last thing we wanted to do was to show Bar Kochba revolution straight in their face. So, all right, they died in an epidemic. All right, these things happen. Died in an epidemic. But that's not what happened, and I can prove it. Take a look at the PU, the last part of the page, and it's going to go over to the other side. The Eila Eskara that we say on Yom Kippur. It's the last thing, source number 9. It's the last thing. The part of it is going to go over to the page. It's the bottom of the second page, I believe, in the bottom. It's Eila Eskara. And what we say on Yom Kippur, the 10 martyrs, the 10 Talmidei Chachamim, Rabbi Akiva and his associates, who were murdered. And it starts with and I'll say outright, a fictitious story, an Aggadic fictitious story of a Roman officer who was learned in Torah and comes to the Beit Midrash and asks a shaila, what is the halacha of gonev ish umcharo v'nimtza biyado, kidnapping somebody and then selling him off? And he asked the great 10 Talmidei Chachamim of the day, and everybody knows it's a pasuk in Chumash, he's to be executed, umeta haganavahu. And then this Roman says, well, you remember the 10 brothers in Parshat Vayeshev who sold Yosef? So nobody ever paid for that crime. And if you would have been there in those days, you would have been the Beit Din because you're the greatest. So you're going to pay for the crime. And it goes on and on and on. And they're all summarily executed in most gruesome form and so on. What is the poet doing in the Eila Eskara if not bringing us back to the scene of the first crime of Sinat Achim, of brotherly hatred? That's what he's doing. He's giving us a theological answer. Why did Rabbi Akiva and his Chaverim and the whole generation of Talmidei Chachamim and the whole Bar Kokhba enterprise collapse? You know why? Open up Parshas Vayeshev and it's a rerun. That's what he's doing. That's what he's doing. And that's how eventually in the days of the Geonim, when they realized like Rav Shrir Gaon, that this wasn't an epidemic, but this was something that could have been a geula, a moment of redemption. And we are sitting in Galut because of it. We shouldn't be having weddings. And they instituted the custom that in this period of time, from Pesach to Shavuot, we won't have weddings. That's how it begins. Yeah.
But the whole story on Yom Kippur is a parable, because the 10 men did not
Live in the same era. Correct. You see clearly that the author had an agenda, a poetic agenda to point out. Right. And he never gave it over as a historic story and so on. There are actually different versions, once you have different versions of it and so on. But what happens afterwards, in Sfarad, in early Sfarad, I say 11th, 12th century, days of the Rambam, he doesn't know of any custom. It didn't make it. This Gaonic custom of not having weddings didn't make it. But then in certain areas of Spain, a tradition arises that what happened to the students of Rabbi Akiva didn't happen for the duration of Pesach till Shavuot, but there was a portion taken off, a third of it at the end. And that's the whole question of how that version enters into the text. Ad mi Pesach ad pros atzeret. Atzeret is Shvuot, Pesach is Pesach. Pros means a section, like prusa, a section. And it was said that the last third, they stopped dying. So the custom of not having weddings from Pesach wasn't until Shavuos, but until Lag BaOmer, which was 2/3 into the system. 1 second. And has nothing at all to do with Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. That came in from a completely different route. But it was that 2/3 of the way, which takes us to the 34th day, and because of Miktzat Hayom Kikulo, that we always look at the last day of Shiva, we get up in the morning of Shiva and don't continue to the end of the day. So the day of the 34th, you can end it first thing in the morning, and you can have already weddings on the 34th. I didn't say the 33rd, the 34th. And Sfardim, until this very day, have the custom not to have weddings till the 34th of the Omer, because of this. These are 2/3. This is how the Sephardi minhag now picks up after the Ramban, which then has a completely different history in Germany with the end of the 11th century with the pogroms, because the dates of the pogroms were the 8th of Iyar, the 23rd of Iyar, Rosh Chodesh Sivan, the 3rd of Sivan, and the day of Shavuot, which is the 6th of Sivan. And you now have a new custom that was grafted on the old custom, and that is a period of mourning from Rosh Chodesh Iyar until Shavuot, what we call the second custom. Has nothing to do with Rabbi Akiva at all. And that set of customs of mourning kicked in with many more stringent opinions of what we don't do. And here's where Shechayanu came in, not to make a Shechayanu in this season, and certainly not to have weddings at all, and so on. And it became a big issue whether you keep the first 33 days or you keep the second part, but it's not, there's an overlap from Rosh Chodesh Iyar. And if you look at Rav Moshe Feinstein writing in New York City, he says today it's a balagan, and therefore, he doesn't use the word balagan, but he says a mix-up, and people came to America with different customs, and the custom was just to keep 33 days of Sphira, of mourning, and therefore you can flip from one year to the other. So if you get an invitation to a wedding before Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and your minhag is to actually have mourning at that period, you can go to the wedding and this year do it the other way. And same thing after Lag Baimer, if your custom was to keep the Avelut until Shavuos, but you got invited to a wedding for some guy who made a wedding after Lag Baimer, as long as the Baal Simcha, the person making the Simcha, is covered and it's part of his minhag, you can then be Mesameach Hatan V'Kala, and you're allowed to go, and you can flip the minhag annually, and that's a very interesting point of view. Ramesh Feinstein doesn't go into the history of what I just said, but the one who really documented this whole thing very well was Professor Daniel Sperva in volume 1 of an 8-volume work called Minhagei Yisrael. He has the whole evolution of the whole business of the Sphira, of how it came about. Now, I want next week to come back to this, so I'll be very happy to collect the pages from you, to promise that I will bring them next week, and then we're going to continue with, because I'm not going to have them print up this page. I'm going to print up something else to continue, but I left this little hanging here because I do want to do this poem, and it's going to be relevant for next week and the week after anyway. So we're going to do the poem as well. I'll just tell you that I remember back in my my Borough Park days from 1962 until I moved out in 75 when I got married. So the Chazonim, and we had Moshe Kusevitsky there until he died in 66. My father, Olav Sholem, told me something very prophetic. He said, Moshe is not getting any younger. And my father was a smart man. He wasn't getting any younger, and we should go hear him once in a while. So we used to go hear him for Slichus, and we used to go hear him for Shmini Atzeret, and once in a while for Birkat HaChodesh. I remember 3 times a year we went to Kusevitsky, but I remember they used to have a thing called a Sphira concert. You don't know about this here in Israel. A Sphira concert, because people didn't go to the movies, they didn't go to entertainment during the Sphira, but a Chazonis concert was considered okay. Now, of course, some people think listening to Chazonis is Avelis, you know, because I can tell you that the Rav once told us that he likes Chazonis very, very much, but not in shul. You agree? But, he said on the radio, on a record, he said a record, remember records? Used to be a thing called records, right? And in a recording, fine. But we went to a Sphira concert, and I remember that there was a choir, and there was an organ. There was an organ there, and those days I was a big tzaddik, and I graduated from that a long time ago. Because I remember my father coming home from a long day of work after Pesach and putting on classical music to sit down in the living room and just unwind. And I was a tzaddik, and I said, it's a Sphira, Haggadah music. My father explained to me patiently, believe me, patiently, and he said, the only music that's asur is music of simcha, not music of relaxation. I remember him telling me that, and it was so true, because I've already had people telling me I have to go to the dentist, and he has music in the background. I said, that music is to calm you down a little bit. When your person is sitting shiva or shloishim, let's say, they shut off the radio when there's a jingle of Coca-Cola commercial. That's not what Chazal said, that we don't know music. It's music that promotes simcha. So I remember there was a very big Talmud Chacham Rav, Rabbi Shor, Rabbi Israel Shor, Zechor L'Bracha, who functioned until age 99, by the way, as the rabbi of Bethel. And if he allowed organ at the concert of Moshe Kusevitsky during the days of Sphira, I realized that it must be okay. Even though then I didn't understand 100% why, but later on in life I realized it must have been okay. He would not have allowed something so public like an organ playing at this concert, at the Sphira concert. And I remember he used to speak before the concerts. And a lot of people were very upset because they came to hear Moshe Kusevitsky. But nevertheless, he gave a little Dvar Torah before, and he said, Sphira concert is a contradiction. Because a concert is the gaiety usually and simcha, and Sphira kicks in avelut. And then he explained how simcha and evel go together in the Jewish experience. It was a brilliant, brilliant Dvar Torah. Not many people were paying attention to it. They just wanted him to finish up. But I listened carefully, and I was very impressed with that Dvar Torah early in my life. And Moshe Kusevitsky was also good. He was very good that night. We live it here. My wife is correct. We live it here. The Simcha and Evel of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaTzmaut together. We very much live with these two things at the same time. It's difficult. It's very difficult. But we're somehow trained to be able to live with Simcha and Evel together. Right, correct. That's why when we say Hallel, in one breath, Hodu Lashem ki tov ki ulam chasdo, min ha-meitzar karati la, Ana Hashem Mashiachna, Ana Hashem Matzlichana. We know we're not out of the woods yet, but we thank Kadosh Baruch Hu every single day for what we have. Right, as the Baditcheva said, the cup is, we're going to look at it as half full or half empty. We should always look at it as half full and be more optimistic, but know that we have to still fill it up. There's still tikkun that has to go on. Shkoyach.